Before we start today's episode, a quick content warning. This episode contains discussion of suicide and the Holocaust. These are deeply serious and upsetting subjects, so viewer discretion is advised. He gave form to modern anxiety. He transformed fear, guilt, and alienation into literature. He wrote worlds where bureaucracy crushed the individual, logic collapsed, and punishment arrived without explanation. His work was misunderstood in his lifetime, largely unpublished and dismissed by many as strange or unreadable. Yet his name would go on to define an entire way of understanding modern existence. But behind the unsettling stories was a life lived in torment. Illness, insomnia, fraught family relationships, failed engagements, self-doubt, and a constant struggle between writing and the expectations placed upon him. This is the Author Files. I'm Kane, and this is the haunting, conflicted, and profoundly human life of Franz Kafka. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Author Files. Today we're opening the case file on a man who turned anxiety, alienation, and quiet dread into literature that still crawls under our skin. Franz Kafka didn't write sprawling epics or cozy stories. He wrote nightmares that feel uncomfortably familiar, stories where the world is absurd, authority is faceless, and the individual is always on the verge of being crushed by systems they don't understand. Born in Prague at the turn of the 20th century, Franz lived a life marked by illness, insecurity, and a deep sense of not quite belonging, culturally, socially, or even within his own body. And yet from that inner turmoil came some of the most influential works of modern literature. The Metamorphoses, The Trial, and The Castle, texts so distinctive that his name became an adjective. In this episode, we're exploring Franz not as a gloomy myth or a tortured genius caricature, but as a deeply human writer, one obsessed with guilt, power, family, and the fear that something is fundamentally wrong, even when no one can explain what. This is the story of a man who believed he was failing at life while quietly redefining what literature can do. So grab yourself a cuppa, get comfortable, and let's explore the life of Franz Kafka. Franz Kafka was born on the 3rd of July, 1883. Franz was born near Prague's Old Town Square, which at the time was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Franz's family were German-speaking, middle-class Ashkenazi Jews. Franz's father, Hermann Kafka, was the fourth child of Jacob Kafka, a shochet, a kosher butcher from Ozek, a Czech village in southern Bohemia, which had a large Jewish population. Hermann moved to Prague in the 1870s, where he opened up a shop selling haberdashery and ladies' accessories. At its height, the business employed up to 15 people, and Hermann adopted the image of a jackdaw, meaning Kafka in Czech, pronounced and often written colloquially as the Kafka that we all know how to spell it as. Franz's mother Julie was the daughter of Jacob Lowy, a cloth maker from Humpolek in eastern Bohemia. Franz's parents were raised with traditional Jewish society, and they spoke German heavily influenced by their native Yiddish. However, their children, including Franz, grew up in a more culturally assimilated environment, and they spoke standard German. The clarity and what has been described as the almost platonic purity of Kafka's German may stem from the fact that he learned and used the language in a country where German was not the dominant tongue. As a result, his future prose is free from slang and largely untouched by fashionable turns of phrase that shaped the writing of many of his contemporaries, whether those writing from the imperial heart of Vienna or from Berlin. Franz's father, Hermann Kafka, has been described by Kafka scholar and translator Stanley Korngold as a huge, selfish, overbearing businessman. Franz himself offered an even more detailed and cutting portrait, describing his father as a true Kafka, strong, healthy, loud, eloquent, self-satisfied, and dominating, with great endurance, presence of mind, and an acute understanding of human nature. Alongside a grand way of doing things, but also burdened with the defects and weaknesses that accompanied these traits, fueled by his temperament and, at times, his hot temper. Franz's deeply troubled relationship with his father is laid bare in Letters to His Father, a document running to more than 100 pages, in which he describes how profoundly he was affected by his father's authoritarian and demanding nature. By contrast, his mother is remembered as quiet and shy. The dominating presence of Franz's father would go on to exert a significant influence on his writing. Hermann and Julie Kafka had 6 children, with Franz being the eldest. 2 of his brothers, George and Heinrich, unfortunately died in infancy before Franz reached the age of 7. His 3 sisters were Gabrielle, known as Ellie, Valerie, and Ottilie. From 1889 to 1893, Franz attended the German boys' elementary school at the meat market. His former Jewish education came to an end with his bar mitzvah at the age of 13. Franz never enjoyed attending the synagogue and went with his father only on the 4 major high holidays of each year. After leaving elementary school in 1893, Franz was admitted to the demanding classics-focused state gymnasium. The academic secondary school was located in the Old Town Square within the Kingsley Palace. German was the language of instruction, though Franz also spoke and wrote in Czech. He studied Czech at the gymnasium for 8 years and achieved good grades. He received praise for his Czech, but never regarded himself as fluent, and he spoke German with a Czech accent. Franz completed his examinations in 1901, and later in that same year, Franz was admitted to a university in Prague. He had initially enrolled to study philosophy and had also signed up for chemistry. However, after just 2 weeks, he abandoned chemistry and switched to law. Although the subject did not particularly interest him, it offered a broad range of career options, which pleased his father. Law also required a longer course of study, giving Franz the opportunity to attend classes in German studies and art history. During his time at university, Franz joined a student organization known as the Reading and Lecture Hall of the German Students, which hosted literary events, readings, and discussions. At the end of his first year, Franz met Max Brod, a fellow law student who would become his closest friend for life. Years later, Brod coined the term the Close Prague Circle to describe their group of writers, which included Franz. Brod quickly noticed that although Franz was shy and spoke infrequently, when he did speak, his remarks were usually profound. Franz was an avid reader throughout his life. Together, he and Brod enjoyed Plato's Protagoras in the original Greek version. On the 18th of June 1906, Franz was awarded the degree of Doctor of Law. He then undertook the obligatory year of unpaid service as a law clerk in both the civil and criminal courts. On the 1st of November 1907, Franz took up employment with an insurance company, where he worked for almost a year. His correspondence from this period reveals deep dissatisfaction with his working hours, from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening, a schedule that left him with little energy or focus for writing, which was becoming increasingly central to his life. So on the 15th of July 1908, Franz resigned. Just 2 weeks later, Franz found work far more compatible with his literary ambitions when he joined the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute for the Kingdom of Bohemia. The role involved investigating and assessing compensation claims for industrial injuries. Accidents such as the loss of fingers or even limbs were distressingly common at the time due to poor workplace safety standards, particularly in factories using drills, planing machines, and rotary saws, which were often operated without protective guards. Franz's father would frequently refer to his son's position as an insurance officer as a Brotberuf, meaning a bread job, meaning work done purely to earn a living. Franz himself often claimed to despise it. Despite this, he was promoted quickly. His responsibilities included processing and investigating compensation claims, writing detailed reports, and handling appeals from factory owners who believed their businesses had been assigned an unfairly high-risk category, resulting in increased insurance premiums. For several years, Franz also compiled and wrote the Institute's annual report, which was consistently well received by his superiors. Franz would typically finish work by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, leaving him time to devote himself to his writing, to which he remained deeply committed. At the same time, though, his father expected him to assist in and eventually take over the family's fancy goods shop. In later years, Franz's decline in health would often prevent him from working regularly, both at the insurance bureau and on his literary output, but more about that later. In the later months of 1911, Franz and his brother-in-law, Karl Hermann, Ellie's husband, became partners in Prague's first asbestos factory. The venture was funded using money from Hermann Kafka's dowry. Initially, Franz approached the business with enthusiasm and devoted much of his spare time to it. Over time, however, he grew resentful of the way it encroached on his writing. During this same period, Franz developed a strong interest in Yiddish theatre, finding both enjoyment and stimulation in its performances. After watching a Yiddish theatre troupe in October 1911, he spent the next 6 months immersed in Yiddish language and in Yiddish literature. This engagement also marked the beginning of a deeper exploration of his Jewish identity. It was also around this time that Franz decided to become a vegetarian. The Kafka family lived with a servant girl in a cramped apartment, and Franz's room was often bitterly cold. In November 1913, the family moved into a larger apartment, although Ellie and Valley had already married and moved out of the original home. Then in early August 1914, shortly after the outbreak of the First World War, the sisters were unsure of their husbands' whereabouts while they were serving in the military, so they returned to live with the family in this larger apartment. Both Ellie and Valley had children. So at the age of 31, Franz moved into Valley's former apartment, which was noticeably quieter. And for the first time in his life, he lived alone. Around 1915, Franz received a draft notice for military service during the First World War. His employers at the Insurance Institute, however, arranged a deferment on the grounds that his work constituted essential government service. Franz would later attempt to enlist but was prevented from doing so due to medical issues connected to tuberculosis, which he was diagnosed with in 1917. In 1918, the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute placed Franz on a pension due to his illness, which at the time had no cure. He would spend much of the remainder of his life in sanatoriums. That's very sad and very unfortunate, especially as Franz was a very talented and he had so much more to give to the world. But don't fear, as we are nowhere near the end of our deep dive into Franz Kafka's life. Now, let's look at his personal life. Did he have a lover? Was he involved with anybody? Well, let's investigate. So Franz never married. According to his best friend Max, Franz was tortured by sexual desire and consumed by a fear of sexual failure. For most of his adult life, Franz visited brothels, and his collection of erotica and pornographic photographs reveals what has been described as a connoisseur's range of interests in the genre. Alongside this, he formed close and emotionally complex relationships with several women. On the 13th of August 1912, Franz met Felice Bauer, a relative of Brod's who worked in Berlin as a representative for a dictaphone company. A week after meeting her at Brod's home, Franz recorded his first impressions in his diary. He wrote, "Miss F.B. When I arrived at Brod's on the 13th of August, she was sitting at the table. I was not at all curious about who she was, but rather took her for granted at once. Bony, empty face that wore its emptiness openly, bare throat, a blouse thrown on, looked very domestic in her dress, although as it turned out she by no means was. I alienate myself from her a little by inspecting her so closely. Almost broken nose, blonde, somewhat straight, unattractive hair, strong chin. As I was taking my seat, I looked at her closely for the first time. By the time I was seated, I already had an unshakable opinion. Shortly after this meeting, Franz wrote the story The Judgment in a single night. During this intensely productive period, he also worked on The Man Who Disappeared and The Metamorphoses. Over the next 5 years, Franz and Felice communicated largely through letters, met only occasionally, and became engaged twice. Franz's surviving letters to Felice were later published as Letters to Felice, but her replies did not survive. After writing to Felice's father to ask for permission to marry her, Franz reflected bleakly on the conflict between marriage, work, and his vocation. In his diary, he wrote, "My job is unbearable to me because it conflicts with my only desire and my only calling, which is literature. I am nothing but literature and can and want to be nothing else. Nervous states of the worst sort of control me without pause. A marriage could not change me, just as my job cannot change me." According to biographers Rainer Stack and James Hawes, Franz would get engaged for the third time in 1920, this time to a woman named Julie, who was a poor and uneducated hotel chambermaid. Franz's father objected strongly to this engagement because of Julie's Zionist beliefs. Although Franz and Julie rented a flat together and even set a wedding date, the marriage never took place. During this period, Franz began drafting letters to his father, and before the intended wedding date, he became involved with yet another woman. Brod would state that during the period Franz knew Felice, he was also having an affair with her friend Marguerite, known as Greet, a Jewish woman from Berlin. Brod claimed that Bloch gave birth to Franz's son. Although Franz never knew of the child's existence, the boy, whose name is unknown, was born in either 1914 or 1915 and died in Munich in 1921. And just for context, because I think I skimmed over it, Bloch is Marguerite. However, Franz's biographer Peter Andre Alt disputes this account, arguing that while Bloch did have a son, Franz was not the father, as the two were never intimate. Other biographers note that the historical evidence on this matter is contradictory. In August of 1917, Franz was diagnosed with tuberculosis. He moved for several months to a Bohemian village where his sister Otla was working on the farm of her brother-in-law Karl Hermann. Franz felt at ease there and later described this period as perhaps the best of his life, largely because he had no responsibilities. During this time, Franz kept diaries and filled exercise books. From these notes, Franz extracted 109 numbered fragments written on slips of paper, which were later published. In 1920, Franz entered into an intense relationship with a lady called Melina, a Czech journalist and writer. Melina was non-Jewish and married at the time, although Franz described her marriage as a sham. His letters to her were published as Letters to Melania. During a holiday in July 1923 to a Baltic seaside resort, Franz then met Dora Diamond, a 25-year-old kindergarten teacher from an Orthodox Jewish family. Hoping to escape the influence of his family and focus entirely on his writing, Franz moved briefly to Berlin, where he lived with Diamond from September 1923 until March 1924. She became his lover and rekindled his interest in the Talmud. During this final creative period, Franz completed 4 stories, which were published after his death under the title A Hunger Artist. It wouldn't be wrong to say that although Franz's life was short, he certainly took great interest in the ladies. But what about his novels? Some of his stories are so well known, so let's explore them a bit more. Franz began working on his first novel in 1912. Its opening chapter was the story The Stoker. He would refer to the novel, which he never finished, as The Man Who Disappeared and sometimes as The Missing Person. However, when Max Brod published the manuscript after Franz's death, Max gave it the title of America. The inspiration for the novel came from the time Franz spent attending Yiddish theatre performances the previous year. The experience gave him a renewed awareness of his own heritage and led him to the idea that an innate appreciation of one's heritage exists deep within every individual. More overtly humorous and slightly more realistic than much of Franz's other work, the novel nevertheless shares a familiar Kafkaesque motif, an oppressive intangible system that repeatedly places the protagonist in bizarre and bewildering situations. The book draws heavily on details taken from the experiences of Franz's relatives who had emigrated to America, and it remains the only work for which Franz ever considered an optimistic ending. In 1914, Franz began work on the novel The Trial. It tells the story of a man who's arrested and prosecuted by a remote and inaccessible authority, with the nature of his crime never revealed, either to him or the reader. Franz did not complete the novel, although he did finish its final chapter. According to his diary, Franz was already planning another novel, The Castle, by the 11th of June 1914, although he did not begin writing it until the 27th of January 1922. The novel centers on a land surveyor known only as K, who struggles for reasons never fully explained to gain access to the mysterious authorities of a castle that governs the village. Franz intended that on his deathbed the castle authorities would inform Kay that his legal claim to live in the village was not valid, yet taking certain auxiliary circumstances into account, he was permitted to live and work there. Dark and often surreal, the novel focuses on themes of alienation, bureaucracy, and the seemingly endless frustration of human attempts to resist an incomprehensible system, as well as the futile and hopeless pursuit of an unattainable goal. Franz's other notable stories include Description of a Struggle, The Metamorphoses, and In the Penal Colony. Franz's works are iconic and are still very much loved and read today. But what was Franz like himself? What was his personality? Well, here's everything we know about him. Franz carried a lifelong suspicion that others found him mentally and physically repulsive. Yet those who met him described something quite different. A man with a quiet, composed manner, obvious intelligence, and a dry, understated sense of humour. Many also found him boyishly handsome, if austere in appearance. He was widely regarded as being very self-analytic. Franz's best friend Max compared him to Heinrich von Kleist, noting that both writers shared an ability to describe situations with striking realism and precise detail. Max believed Franz was one of the most entertaining people he had ever known. Franz enjoyed sharing his humour with his friends and was also known for offering thoughtful advice when others were struggling. According to Max, he was a passionate reciter, able to shape language so that his speech sounded almost musical. Max identified two of Franz's most defining qualities as absolute truthfulness and precise conscientiousness. Franz's letters and his diaries reveal the presence of homoerotic themes, including an imagined scenario involving the novelist Franz Werfel and references to the work of Hans Bleuer on male bonding. The historian Saul Friedlander has argued that his internal psychological struggle may have shaped Franz's recurring themes of alienation and psychological brutality. Although Franz showed little interest in physical exercise as a child, he later developed a strong enthusiasm for games and outdoor activity. Franz became an accomplished rider, swimmer, and rower. At weekends, he and his friends would set out on long hikes, often planned by Franz himself. His interests were wide-ranging and included alternative medicine, modern educational approaches, and emerging technologies like aeroplanes and cinema. Writing, however, was central to Franz's existence. He regarded it as a form of prayer. He was extremely sensitive to noise and preferred complete silence when writing. Franz also abstained from alcohol. Although Franz never married, he held marriage and family life in high regard. Over the course of his life, he had several girlfriends and lovers. Some scholars have suggested that he may have suffered from an eating disorder. Dr. Manfred M. Fichter of the psychiatric clinic at the University of Munich presented what he described as evidence for the hypothesis that the writer Franz Kafka had suffered from an atypical anorexia nervosa. He argued that Franz was not only lonely and depressed but also occasionally suicidal. In his 1995 book Franz Kafka, The Jewish Patient, Sander Gilman explored contemporary ideas about why Jewish men were often labeled hypochondriacal or homosexual, and examined how Franz absorbed and reflected these assumptions in his self-image and writing. Franz is known to have contemplated suicide at least once in late 1912. So now that we've learnt more about what type of personality Franz had, let's find out more about Franz's last days and also discover what happened to his siblings. So Franz's tuberculosis worsened steadily, and in March 1924 he returned from Berlin to Prague. There, members of his family, chiefly his sister Otla, as well as Dora, cared for him. On the 10th of April, Franz was admitted to Hugo Hoffmann's sanatorium in Kierling, which is just outside of Vienna, for treatment. Sadly, Franz died there on the 3rd of June, 1924. The cause of death was effectively starvation. The condition of Franz's throat had become so severe that eating was unbearably painful. Since parenteral nutrition, feeding through intravenous methods, had not yet been developed, there was no way to provide Franz with the nourishment his body so needed. Remarkably, despite all of this, Franz was still editing the story A Hunger Artist on his deathbed, a work he had begun composing before his throat became too damaged to swallow. After his death, Franz's body was brought back to Prague, where he was buried on the 11th of June 1924 in the New Jewish Cemetery. His obituary was published in well-known journals. Although during his lifetime Franz was virtually unknown, though he himself did not consider fame to be important. His renown grew rapidly after his death, especially following the Second World War. Franz's tombstone was designed by the architect Leopold Ehrmann. But you may be thinking that Franz was relatively unknown during his lifetime, and you'd be correct to think that. He became famous because his dying wish was ignored. Franz's dying wish was that the remainder of his literary footprint was also to be destroyed in the wake of his passing. He bestowed this responsibility onto his literary executor and close friend Max, but with a rebellious defiance and likely knowing what gold dust he was holding on to, Franz's desires were not followed. Instead of extinguishing Franz's literary legacy without a trace, Brod indeed ignited it by publishing his 3 novels, The Trial, The Castle, and America, in 1927. Although the works were incomplete, likely owing to Franz's indecisiveness and lack of confidence, they nevertheless set the world alight, particularly in Germany after the conclusion of World War II. So if it wasn't for Max, the world would not have known how much of a literary master Franz was. But what about his siblings? Did they have a happy ending? Let's see. As we know from the start of the episode, Franz was the eldest of 6 children. Franz had 2 brothers, George and Heinrich, who both sadly died in infancy. He then had 3 sisters, Ellie, Vali, and Otla. Gabrielle, known as Ellie, was Franz's eldest sister, and she attended a German girls' school in Prague, followed by a private secondary school for girls. In 1910, she married Karl Hermann, a salesman. They had 3 children, a son, Felix, and 2 daughters, Gertrude and Hannah. After her marriage, Gabrielle grew closer to Franz, whose letters reveal his keen interest in the upbringing and education of her children. In 1915, he accompanied her on a trip to Hungary to visit Karl. who was stationed there with the military. The outbreak of the Great Depression in 1929 brought financial hardship to the Hermann family business, which eventually went bankrupt. Karl Hermann died on the 27th of February 1939, after which Gabrielle was financially supported by her sisters. On the 21st of October 1941, Ellie was deported, along with her daughter Hannah, to the Lodz ghetto. There, in the spring of 1942, she lived temporarily with her sister Vali and Vali's husband. It is believed that Ellie and Vali were then killed later that year, probably at the Kulmhof extermination camp. Of Gabrielle's 3 children, only her daughter Gertrude survived the Second World War. Today, a memorial plaque honours the 3 sisters at the family grave in the New Jewish Cemetery in Prague. As for Otla, she was sent to the concentration camp at Theresienstadt on the 5th of October 1943. Otla accompanied a group of children as a voluntary assistant. When the transport reached Auschwitz concentration camp 2 days later, all were murdered in the gas chambers, and all 3 of Franz's sisters were sadly killed during the Holocaust. By 1943, the Kafka children were dead. Franz was taken by a horrid illness, and his dear sisters victims of the Holocaust. May they all rest in peace. Some other notable mentions of Franz's life are: the political upheavals of the early 20th century gave Franz a great deal to reflect on. The overthrow of the Tsar and the rise of communism in Russia were particularly significant, especially for a writer living in a region that would later become central to the Eastern Socialist bloc. While it is widely accepted that these political developments influenced Franz's writing, scholars continue to debate the precise nature of that influence. Some argue that his work satirizes Western capitalism, while others interpret it as a critique of rigid and uncompromising socialist ideology. Once again, Franz's writing resists a single fixed interpretation. Franz's upbringing in Prague as a German-speaking Jew also meant that he was exposed to multiple cultures from an early age. Although he described himself as an atheist, his Jewish heritage played an important role in shaping his intellectual interests, leading him to explore the work of various Yiddish writers. This influence is particularly evidenced in his first novel, America, which was inspired by Yiddish theatre and examines themes of family, heritage, and the desire for social acceptance. Franz also suffered from significant mental distress. In addition to his physical illnesses, later scholars and clinicians have suggested that he may have experienced a range of mental health conditions, including borderline personality disorder, psychophysiological insomnia, eating disorders, and even schizophrenia. Evidence for these claims is typically drawn from his distinctive writing style, his personal letters and diaries, and anecdotal accounts from those closest to him. In his private writings, Franz acknowledged that he contemplated suicide in the early 20th century, and his fiction frequently demonstrates an intense preoccupation with death. Franz Kafka's life, when laid bare, feels almost unbearably fragile. A man caught between languages, cultures, expectations, and identities. A man who felt perpetually watched, judged, and inadequate by his father, by institutions, and by his own mind. He lived with the constant sense that he was failing at life itself, even as he was quietly reshaping literature in ways no one would fully recognize until long after he was gone. Kafka wrote from a place of deep unease. His stories are not puzzles to be solved, but experiences to be endured. They reflect a world where authority is faceless, guilt is assumed, and meaning is endlessly deferred. And what makes that so haunting is that Franz did not invent these anxieties. He lived them. His fiction is steeped in illness, fear, isolation, and the relentless pressure to justify one's own existence. There is something profoundly tragic in the fact that Franz never believed in the worth of his own work. He asked for it to be burned, convinced it did not deserve to survive him. And yet what those pages contained was not insignificance, but truth, an honesty so sharp it unsettles readers more than a century later. His refusal to see his own value mirrors the very despair his writing captures so precisely. Franz's legacy is inseparable from loss. He died young, in pain, unable to eat, editing a story about starvation as his own body failed him. His sisters were murdered in the Holocaust. The world he feared, one governed by incomprehensible power and silent cruelty, arrived with horrifying clarity. In that sense, Franz did not merely imagine the future, he anticipated it. And yet his work endures not because it predicts catastrophe, but because it speaks to the inner lives of those who feel overwhelmed by it. Franz gives voice to the anxiety of existing in systems that do not care about who we are, only that we comply. He articulates the fear that we are guilty without knowing why, and that no explanation will ever be sufficient. These are not abstract ideas, they are emotional realities many people still recognize today. Franz never offered hope in the traditional sense. There are no triumphant endings, no moral resolutions, but there is understanding. In reading Franz's work we are seen. Our confusion, our dread, our sense of not quite fitting into the world, all of it is acknowledged, and perhaps that is his quiet mercy. Franz Kafka may have believed himself to be nothing more than literature, but in truth he became something far greater, a voice for the anxious, the marginalized, the silenced, and the unseen. He reminds us that even the most private suffering can resonate across generations, and that meaning can exist even when it feels impossibly out of reach. Franz died thinking he had failed, but history tells a very different story. Okay, so that was the life of Franz Kafka. I found this one quite difficult to research, especially when reading about his illness, his mental health, and of course, the terrible death of his sisters. But I hope through this episode you've learnt a bit more about the man that is regarded in such high esteem with his literature. And next week we're going to be diving into the life of Mary Shelley, the infamous Frankenstein creator. And as usual, if you've enjoyed this episode, please leave a like, comment, follow, review, anywhere you listen to your podcast. It will really help us to grow. In the meantime, you can follow us on Instagram at the Author Files Podcast, or you can go to our new website, which is www.theauthorfiles.co.uk, where I will be posting updates and all the latest news and what's coming up. And you can also click on the authors and find out a bit more about them. It's being updated constantly. Anyway, I will see you guys next Friday for our Mary Shelley episode. And in the meantime, stay safe, stay reading, and stay happy. See ya.